Danny Reed was driving through the city, heading to a meeting he had been looking forward to. It was a busy afternoon and the streets were full of cars. The traffic light ahead turned red, so he slowed down. He could see a lot of cars honking, but something strange caught his eye. In the middle of the intersection, there was a stray dog. It wasn't moving at all. Cars were honking and trying to go around the dog, but it didn't seem bothered. The dog just sat there, staring straight ahead, as if it didn't care about the chaos surrounding it. Danny, surprised by the sight, slowed his car even more and stopped. He looked at the dog, wondering why it wasn't moving. It was a strange thing to see in the middle of such a busy place. Most dogs would run out of the way when they heard the noise, but this one didn't. Danny decided to get out of his car. He had seen many stray dogs before, but this one seemed different. He walked towards the dog, trying to figure out why it was just sitting there. The dog was medium-sized, with a matted coat, and appeared a little tired. It didn't seem to have a collar or any tags, which meant it was probably a stray that had been living on the streets for a while. As Danny got closer, the dog looked up at him. Its eyes were wide and full of trust, but it didn't move. Danny crouched down slowly and spoke softly to the dog. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he didn't want to make the situation worse. "Hey buddy, what are you doing here?" Danny said quietly, hoping to calm the dog down. For a moment, it seemed like the dog was listening. It didn't bark or growl, just stared at Danny. He gently reached out to pet its head, and the dog didn't pull away. Instead, it seemed to relax a little. Danny could tell it wasn't hurt, but something about its behavior felt off. Suddenly, without warning, the dog stood up. It looked over at Danny and then quickly ran across the intersection, weaving through traffic. Cars honked and swerved. The dog moved quickly and confidently. Danny, curious about what the dog was doing, ran after it. The dog reached the other side of the street and stopped at the entrance of an alley. It turned back to look at Danny, almost as if it was waiting for him to follow. Danny paused for a second, unsure of what to do. But then, something in the dog's gaze told him that it wanted him to follow. Without thinking twice, Danny started walking towards the alley, moving quickly so he wouldn't lose track of the dog. The alley was narrow and dark, with trash bins on both sides and a few old cars parked along the walls. The dog moved fast, darting between the obstacles as it led Danny further into the alley. Danny kept pace, his curiosity growing. Why had the dog stopped in the middle of the intersection? And why was it leading him here? After a few more steps, the dog stopped in front of a rusty metal door at the end of the alley. It sat down, staring at the door. Danny looked at the dog, then at the door. It didn't look special, just an old, worn door. But the dog seemed certain this was where it needed to be. Danny walked up to the door, wondering what he was supposed to do. He put his hand on the handle, feeling a slight sense of unease, but he didn't hesitate. The dog had led him this far, and something told him he had to find out what was behind that door. With a deep breath, Danny opened the door, ready for whatever came next. Danny stepped into the dark room behind the door, holding his flashlight in one hand. The moment he entered, he felt a slight chill in the air. The room was large, filled with old crates, piles of boxes, and stacks of unused furniture. It looked like an old warehouse, abandoned for years. The only sound in the room was the soft tapping of the dog's paws against the concrete floor. The dog had already entered before him and was standing near the back of the room, looking around. It seemed calm but alert, its ears up and eyes scanning every corner. Danny slowly walked inside, his flashlight beam sweeping across the room. The crates were covered in dust, and the shelves were empty. It looked like no one had used this place in a long time. Danny stopped near the dog, who was sitting in front of one of the crates, looking up at him. The dog didn't bark, but its body language was clear. It wanted Danny to come closer. He walked over to the crate, his curiosity growing. The crate was large, old, and covered in dust. It didn't look like it belonged in the warehouse, and Danny couldn't help but wonder why the dog had led him here. There were no markings on the crate to suggest it was important, but the dog seemed insistent. It barked twice, then pawed at the crate's side. All right, let's see what you found," Danny said, crouching down in front of the crate. He wasn't sure what to expect, but something about the way the dog acted made him believe this wasn't just a random discovery. Danny gently pushed the crate aside, making space to see what was behind it. The dog moved back a little, giving him room, but its eyes stayed locked on the crate. When Danny moved the last part of the crate out of the way, he saw what the dog had been focused on, a hidden compartment in the floor. It was a small metal hatch, slightly covered by debris. Danny knelt down and brushed the dirt away. The hatch was locked, but the lock seemed old and weak. He pulled on it gently, and to his surprise, it opened with a soft creak. The dog barked again, as if urging him to go further. With the flashlight in his hand, Danny peered into the small compartment. Inside was a stack of neatly organized envelopes, each one carefully labeled with different names. The labels seemed random, but there was something odd about them. Danny's heart began to race as he realized the names weren't of ordinary people. They looked like fake identities. The dog was sitting at his feet, still watching, waiting for the next move. Danny took one of the envelopes and opened it. Inside, he found documents with more names and addresses, along with pictures of people Danny didn't recognize. There was something strange about it all, and he could feel the weight of what he had just uncovered. Before he could read further, there was a sudden noise behind him. The dog stood up quickly, growling low, and Danny spun around, his instincts kicking in. He didn't know who or what was behind him, but he knew the dog was warning him. Danny quickly stood, ready for anything. He looked around, his hand hovering near the small stash of documents. He was alone in the warehouse, but the dog's reaction told him there was danger. Whatever was going on in this place, it was clear that the dog wasn't just a random stray. It was trying to protect him, and there was more to this story than he had realized. Danny glanced at the dog. "What's going on here, huh?" he muttered, his voice low. The dog didn't respond but kept its eyes on the shadows at the back of the warehouse, as if waiting for something or someone. The tension in the air was thick. Danny knew he had to be careful. Whatever he had uncovered, it was leading to something bigger, and it was clear the dog knew exactly what was going on. Danny stepped through the door into what seemed to be an old warehouse. The room was dim, with only a few beams of light coming through cracks in the walls. It smelled like dust and old wood. The air felt cooler than outside, and everything looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The floor was covered in dirt, and there were stacks of crates and boxes scattered around the space. The dog, who had followed him inside, walked confidently into the warehouse, sniffing the air and darting around. It moved as if it knew exactly where it was going. Danny stayed close, keeping an eye on the dog as it explored the area. The dog didn't seem scared or lost. It acted like it was in its element, like this place was familiar to it. Danny looked around, noticing a few people in the back of the warehouse, sorting through boxes and crates. They seemed busy and didn't notice him at first. Danny raised an eyebrow, wondering why the dog had brought him here. This was an unusual place for a stray dog to be. It didn't look like the kind of place where a dog would just wander in. The dog barked once and ran towards the back of the warehouse. Danny followed, taking careful steps through the clutter. As he walked, he noticed a few things that seemed odd. The people working in the warehouse were focused on their tasks, but they kept glancing at him, looking a little uneasy. Some of them even stopped to stare for a moment before getting back to work. The dog stopped in front of one of the crates at the far end of the room, its tail wagging excitedly. It barked again, more urgently this time, as if trying to tell Danny to take a closer look. Danny walked over, crouching down to get a better look at the crate. It was a large crate covered in dust and dirt, and it seemed out of place. The dog sat in front of it, staring at Danny, waiting. Danny raised an eyebrow, wondering what was inside. The crate looked old, but there was something about it that felt different from the other crates in the room. "Okay, let's see what you're so excited about," Danny muttered to himself. He reached down and moved the crate aside, revealing a hidden compartment beneath it. His eyes widened when he saw what was inside. It wasn't what he expected at all. Instead of more crates or supplies, there was a small stack of neatly packed envelopes. They were old, the paper worn and yellowed with age. Each envelope was labeled with different names, but they all looked like they had been packed carefully and stored for a long time. The dog barked again, urging him to open one of the envelopes. Danny looked down at the dog, then back at the stack. There was something about the way the dog was acting that made him feel this was important. He wasn't sure why, but he had the feeling that this wasn't just about a stray dog leading him to some random crates. This was something bigger. Danny hesitated for a moment before picking up one of the envelopes. He carefully opened it, and inside he found a series of documents and papers. As he flipped through them, he realized they were records that seemed to be related to some sort of underground operation. Stolen goods, mysterious transactions, and names he didn't recognize were mentioned throughout. His heart skipped a beat. He quickly scanned the papers, but before he could look at everything, a loud noise came from the door. People from the warehouse had noticed what he was doing. The dog, now standing protectively in front of Danny, growled lowly. Danny's instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. The workers had started to move toward him, and their faces were serious. The dog's growl grew louder, as if sensing danger. Danny didn't wait to see what would happen next. He grabbed the envelope, stuffing it into his jacket, and quickly moved toward the exit. The dog followed closely behind, barking and keeping pace with him. Danny's thoughts raced as he tried to figure out what was really going on. Why was this dog leading him to these files? What were these people involved in? As he stepped back into the alley, the dog stopped for a moment, turning to face him with its eyes locked on Danny. It seemed to say, "This is only the beginning." Danny nodded silently, now fully aware that this stray dog had led him into something far more serious than he could have imagined, and now he was a part of it. Danny stepped through the rusty metal door and into a dimly lit space. The warehouse smelled old, with a mix of dust and something faintly metallic in the air. He could barely see in the low light, but the dog was already ahead, walking through the room with purpose. The warehouse was filled with rows of stacked crates and boxes, some covered in tarps, others just left open. It looked like a place that had been forgotten, unused for years, but something about the way the dog moved made Danny think there was more to this place than met the eye. The dog didn't stop. It trotted through the maze of crates and boxes, its ears perked, eyes focused ahead. Danny, still unsure of what was going on, followed closely. He felt a strange mix of excitement and confusion. Why had the dog brought him here? And what was it trying to find? As they reached the back of the warehouse, the dog paused near a large crate. It sniffed around the edges and then started scratching at the sides with its paws. Danny approached cautiously, watching the dog's behavior. The dog was clearly intent on something, but what? Danny bent down and noticed something odd. The crate was heavy, and it had a metal lock on it. There was a strange symbol on the side of the crate, one that looked familiar. Danny remembered seeing a similar symbol on the dog's collar earlier, though it had been covered in dirt and fur. "This is strange," Danny muttered to himself, staring at the lock. He looked around the warehouse, wondering if anyone was watching. The air was still, and no one else seemed to be around. The workers from earlier had disappeared, and Danny felt more isolated than ever. The dog barked suddenly, snapping Danny out of his thoughts. It seemed to be urging him to open the crate. Without any other option, Danny looked around for something to break the lock. There was a metal rod lying nearby, and Danny grabbed it, using it to pry open the lock. It took a few minutes, but the lock finally gave way, and Danny lifted the crate's lid. Inside was a stack of neatly packed envelopes, each one sealed with a red wax stamp. Danny's heart skipped a beat. The envelopes looked old, but not too old. There was something official about them, like they were meant to be kept hidden from the world. He picked up the first envelope, and the dog barked again, as if urging him to keep going. Danny carefully opened the envelope, pulling out the first piece of paper inside. The paper was yellowed with age, and the handwriting was neat but firm. As he read through the message, he realized the contents were far more serious than he had expected. It was a list of names, locations, and instructions for moving certain goods. It didn't take long for Danny to understand what he was reading, a list of illegal operations. "This is a smuggling ring," Danny muttered, his mind racing. "This is bigger than I thought." The dog barked again, looking up at Danny as if it understood the significance of what he had found. Danny set the envelope down and opened the next one. This one was different. It had a map inside, showing different locations around the city and beyond. The map seemed to be part of a much larger operation, spanning across multiple areas. As Danny examined the map, he heard a noise from behind him, the sound of footsteps approaching. His heart raced. It seemed like he wasn't alone anymore. The dog growled softly, its eyes fixed on the entrance to the warehouse. Danny quickly closed the crate, trying to act casual, but he knew he had to move fast. Whoever was coming didn't sound friendly. The dog stayed close to Danny, its low growl warning him that danger was near. Danny quickly scanned the area for an escape route. There was a back door on the far side of the room, and he decided that was his best bet. The dog was already heading in that direction, as if it knew the way. Without wasting any time, Danny grabbed the crate and started moving toward the back door, the dog following closely behind. The footsteps were getting louder, and Danny could feel the tension in the air. Whoever was coming was getting closer, and he needed to leave before he got caught. Just as Danny reached the back door, it creaked open, and several men stepped inside. They were armed and looking directly at him. "Not so fast," one of them said, his voice cold and threatening. The dog barked fiercely, standing in front of Danny, ready to defend him. Danny took a deep breath, preparing for the fight ahead. Danny stepped into the alley, following the dog as it led him toward a large, rusted metal door. The dog sat in front of the door, its eyes focused and calm, waiting for Danny to approach. The alley was quiet now, much quieter than the busy intersection they had just left. The only sound was the dog's steady breathing and Danny's footsteps on the cold, hard ground. Danny stood in front of the door for a moment, looking it over. It didn't seem like anything special, but there was something about the way the dog was acting that made him think this was important. The dog had led him here for a reason, and Danny wasn't about to back down now. He reached for the handle and pulled. The door creaked as it slowly opened, revealing a dimly lit room inside. The smell of dust and old wood filled the air, and Danny could barely make out anything in the darkness. The dog walked in without hesitation, its tail wagging slightly. Danny followed, squinting his eyes to adjust to the low light. As his eyes focused, he could see that the room was much larger than he had expected. It was a warehouse filled with large stacks of crates and boxes, all stacked high and covered in dust. The space was filled with a strange stillness, but Danny had a feeling he wasn't alone. He could hear faint noises in the distance, the sounds of people moving around. He looked down at the dog, who was already moving deeper into the room, sniffing the air and wagging its tail. "Are you sure this is where we're supposed to be?" Danny muttered, more to himself than to the dog. The dog didn't respond, of course, but it seemed to know exactly where it was going. It walked toward the back of the room, and Danny followed. As they moved further into the warehouse, Danny noticed a group of people in the far corner, standing near a large stack of crates. They looked up in surprise as Danny and the dog approached. One of the workers glanced over at Danny, his face a mixture of confusion and caution. "Can I help you?" the worker asked, stepping forward. Danny smiled, trying to appear casual. "I'm just following my dog," he said, gesturing toward the animal, who was now sitting in front of a large crate. The dog barked once, as if it was confirming Danny's words. The worker glanced at the dog, then back at Danny. "This is just a storage area. We keep supplies here," he said, his tone a little defensive. Danny wasn't convinced. There was something about the way the worker was acting that made him feel uneasy. "Mind if I take a look?" Danny asked, his voice calm but firm. The worker hesitated, glancing at the other people in the room. Finally, he nodded. "Sure, go ahead," he said, though Danny could tell he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. Danny walked over to the crate the dog was sitting in front of, his curiosity growing. The dog's ears were perked up, and it looked at Danny expectantly. There was something important about this crate, and Danny was determined to find out what it was. He crouched down and started to move the crate aside. The dog barked once, as if urging him to hurry. Danny shifted the crate carefully, revealing a small, hidden compartment beneath it. Inside the compartment was a stack of envelopes, each one neatly labeled with different names. Danny froze for a moment, feeling a strange sense of unease. These weren't the kinds of envelopes you'd find in a storage room. They looked like they contained something important, maybe even dangerous. The dog barked again, as if telling Danny to open them. He didn't hesitate. He reached for the top envelope and pulled it out, his heart racing as he looked at the name written on it. This was more than just a hidden stash. It was part of something bigger. Just then, Danny heard a loud noise from the other side of the warehouse. The sound of footsteps echoed through the room, and before he could react, the door slammed open, and several men stormed in. Danny pushed open the old metal door with a creak. The moment it opened, a rush of cold air hit him. The dim light from the alley didn't reach far into the room, but he could make out the outlines of crates and boxes stacked haphazardly inside. It looked like an abandoned warehouse. The dog, without hesitation, trotted inside, its paws making soft echoes on the concrete floor. Danny followed, stepping cautiously into the dark space. The dog moved quickly, sniffing around the boxes, as if it knew exactly where to go. Danny glanced around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why had the dog brought him here? The air smelled stale and musty, as if no one had been in this place for a long time. There was a faint sound of movement in the distance, shuffling, and maybe voices, but it wasn't clear. Danny's instincts kicked in. Something didn't feel right. This warehouse was too quiet, and the dog seemed to be leading him deeper into it without fear. As Danny walked further into the room, he noticed a few people up ahead. They were busy moving crates and talking in hushed voices. They didn't seem to notice him or the dog at first. Danny was careful not to make any noise, trying to stay unnoticed. The dog, however, had other plans. It trotted up to the nearest worker and barked loudly. The man looked up, startled, and took a step back. His eyes quickly shifted to Danny, who was now standing a few feet behind the dog. The worker's expression changed to one of concern, and he hurriedly waved at the others in the room. "Hey, who let that dog in here?" he shouted. Danny immediately stepped forward. "It's okay," he said, raising a hand to calm the situation. "I didn't mean any trouble." But the moment he said that, the workers froze. Their eyes narrowed, and the atmosphere changed. It was clear they weren't just simple warehouse workers. There was something else going on here. Danny could sense it. He glanced down at the dog, who was now standing still, its ears perked up, its eyes locked onto the workers. The dog had been right. It had brought Danny here for a reason. One of the workers, a tall man with a gruff look, stepped forward. "This is private property," he said, his voice low and tense. "What are you doing here?" Danny stood tall, trying not to show any sign of fear. He wasn't here to fight, but he also wasn't going to back down. "I'm just looking for some answers," he said. "This dog," he motioned to the dog, who was still watching them carefully, "let me here. I don't know why, but it seems important." The tall man didn't seem convinced. "You need to leave. Now. Just as Danny was about to respond, the dog barked again and moved toward one of the crates in the corner. It sat in front of it and began pawing at the ground, looking up at Danny expectantly. Danny's curiosity piqued. "What's in that crate?" he asked, pointing toward the one the dog was focused on. The workers looked at each other, and the tension in the room rose. "Nothing that concerns you," the tall man replied, his voice now colder. Danny wasn't backing down this time. "I think it does concern me," he said firmly, stepping toward the crate. The dog barked again, and Danny knelt down, inspecting the crate. The workers tried to stop him, but Danny was too quick. He moved the crate aside with ease and saw what was hidden underneath. Several large boxes wrapped in plastic. But there was something else. A folder with paperwork scattered around, its contents visible. Danny picked up the folder, flipping it open. Inside were documents with strange codes and addresses. As he looked through them, his heart began to race. The addresses listed were places he knew well, but the names attached to them were unfamiliar, strangers connected to something much bigger. Before Danny could examine it further, the tall man grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "I told you to leave," he growled. Danny yanked his arm away and took a step back. "I'm not leaving until I understand what's going on here," he said, his voice strong. The dog, as if sensing the rising tension, barked one final time, standing between Danny and the workers. It was clear the dog was more than just a stray. It was part of something bigger. Danny looked down at the dog, realizing that this moment was more than a coincidence. It had led him here for a reason, and now it was his turn to uncover the truth. "You're in deep now," the tall man warned, but Danny didn't care. The mystery was just beginning, and with the dog by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. Danny stepped inside the old warehouse, the door creaking as it closed behind him. The air inside was heavy with dust, and the dim light from a few flickering bulbs barely illuminated the room. The space was filled with crates stacked high, and there were piles of boxes scattered around. It looked like a place where people stored old things, nothing out of the ordinary at first glance. The dog, however, seemed to know exactly where it was going. It trotted ahead, weaving through the crates, its tail wagging as it moved deeper into the warehouse. Danny followed, his curiosity growing. The dog's sudden stop and confident walk through the warehouse made him feel like it had been here before. As they reached the back of the warehouse, the dog stopped in front of a large crate in the corner. It sat down and barked once, looking at Danny, as if urging him to look at the crate. Danny bent down to get a better look. The crate was large and old, with a thick layer of dust covering it. It looked out of place among the other more ordinary crates. Danny approached the crate cautiously, sensing that this was more than just an ordinary piece of storage. He ran his hands over the surface, feeling the rough wood beneath his fingers. The dog stood beside him, its ears perked up, watching every move Danny made. It almost seemed like the dog was waiting for him to do something. "All right, let's see what's inside," Danny muttered, pushing against the crate. The wood creaked under his hands, but it didn't budge. He tried again, applying more force, and finally, the lid cracked open just enough for him to peek inside. To his surprise, it wasn't filled with old junk or forgotten supplies. Instead, Danny saw a pile of neatly stacked envelopes, each one labeled with different names. His heart skipped a beat as he realized the envelopes seemed to be organized. This wasn't a random collection of papers. It looked like something important was hidden inside. Danny reached for one of the envelopes. As his fingers touched it, he felt a strange sense of unease, but he ignored it and pulled the envelope out. The dog barked again, as if urging him to open it. Danny tore the envelope open quickly, pulling out a few pieces of paper. The first sheet he read had a list of names and addresses, but there was something more. There were also numbers and codes he didn't understand. Before he could read further, a loud sound suddenly echoed through the warehouse. It was the sound of the main door slamming open. Danny froze. He wasn't sure who was entering, but he had a bad feeling about it. The dog stood up, growling low and protective, its body tense. The warehouse workers who had been going about their tasks before stopped what they were doing. Some of them looked nervous. Danny quickly glanced at the door and saw a group of men storming in, shouting orders and moving swiftly. They were armed. Danny didn't have much time to think. "Get down," one of the men shouted, but Danny didn't wait. He grabbed the nearest object, a metal pipe, and held it up, ready to defend himself. The dog, sensing danger, lunged forward, barking and charging at the men with surprising speed. Danny instinctively moved to shield the dog, but the animal was already ahead, darting around the men and distracting them. Danny acted quickly, moving toward the men with confidence. He knew how to handle situations like this. With swift, calculated moves, he took down the first man, using his size and strength. The dog continued to move in and out, distracting the other men, giving Danny the advantage. In just a few minutes, Danny and the dog had successfully subdued the group. The men were on the ground, tied up and unable to move. The dog stood proudly by Danny's side, its tail wagging as if pleased with the outcome. With the situation under control, Danny quickly turned his attention back to the envelopes. He grabbed the stack of papers and started going through them. The more he read, the more shocked he became. The documents revealed a massive underground operation involving stolen goods, illegal trade, and connections to a large criminal syndicate. It was clear now, this was not just a random discovery. The dog had led him to uncover something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The dog had played a crucial role, not just in getting Danny to the warehouse, but in helping him stop a much bigger crime. It wasn't just a stray, it was a hero in its own right. Danny looked at the dog with newfound respect. Without it, he wouldn't have stumbled upon the operation, and who knew how long it would have continued unchecked. "You did it, buddy," Danny said with a smile, scratching the dog behind the ears. The dog looked up at him with trusting eyes, its tail wagging even more. Danny stood up, looking around the warehouse. What had started as a random encounter with a stray dog had turned into a major discovery. But the mystery was far from over. There was more to uncover, and Danny knew he and the dog would be right in the middle of it. The moment Danny opened the door, a strange feeling swept over him. The air inside was cool and musty, and the space behind the door was dark. He stepped cautiously into the dimly lit room, keeping his flashlight ready. The dog, as if knowing the way, trotted ahead without hesitation. Danny followed, taking in his surroundings. The room was full of stacked crates and old boxes, many of them covered in dust. It looked like an abandoned warehouse that hadn't seen much attention in years. The smell of old wood and metal mixed with the musty air, and Danny couldn't help but feel like something was off. The dog moved quickly, weaving around the crates and heading toward the back of the warehouse. Danny moved slowly behind it, his steps careful as he scanned the room. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he knew the dog had led him here for a reason. At the far end of the room, the dog stopped in front of a large crate. It barked once, then sat down, looking at Danny as if telling him to pay attention. Danny walked over to the crate, noticing that it looked different from the others. It wasn't just a regular crate. It seemed heavy, with more wear and tear. The crate was covered in dust, but there was something strange about it, like it had been placed here deliberately. "All right, what have you found this time?" Danny murmured, kneeling down to examine the crate. He ran his hand along the side, feeling the rough texture of the wood. As he checked it, he noticed something odd. There was a faint imprint of some kind of symbol on the surface. Danny paused. It was hard to make out, but it looked like the same symbols that had appeared on the glowing stone and the box the dog had led him to earlier. His curiosity grew even stronger. The dog barked again, louder this time, clearly eager for Danny to take action. Danny stood up and quickly found the latch on the crate. He wasn't sure what was inside, but after everything he had discovered so far, he knew this was important. With a quick motion, Danny unlocked the crate and opened it. His flashlight beam revealed what was inside, and he couldn't believe his eyes. The crate was filled with a stack of neatly arranged envelopes, each one labeled with different names and numbers. Danny's mind raced. This wasn't just ordinary paperwork. The envelopes looked important, like they contained something valuable. His eyes narrowed as he carefully picked up the first envelope, his hands shaking slightly. The dog sat quietly beside him, watching as he opened it. Inside the envelope was a document with more of the strange symbols Danny had seen earlier. The document appeared to be a list of locations, dates, and a series of numbers. There was also a mention of a shipment. Danny assumed it was some kind of code. The words were cryptic, but he could tell that these papers were connected to something much bigger than just a stray dog leading him into an old warehouse. Suddenly, Danny heard a noise from the entrance of the warehouse. He froze, looking toward the door. The dog's ears perked up as well, and it let out a low growl. Danny quickly glanced back at the crate, then at the dog. Something wasn't right. Before he could react, a group of men burst into the warehouse, shouting as they moved quickly toward Danny. They were clearly armed, and Danny could see the tension in their faces. These men weren't just here to check on the crates. They were here for something specific. The dog immediately stood up and positioned itself in front of Danny, growling louder now, ready to protect. Danny's instincts kicked in. He didn't know who these men were, but it was clear they weren't friendly. "Get down," one of the men yelled, pointing a gun toward Danny. Danny didn't hesitate. He quickly moved to put himself between the men and the dog, ready for whatever came next. The dog barked loudly, standing its ground. It was clear that this was more than just a stray. It was now a protector, keeping Danny safe as the situation grew more intense. The air felt thick with tension as the men moved closer. Danny's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but the dog was his ally now, and together, They were going to face whatever this mystery threw at them. Danny stepped into the warehouse, the door creaking behind him as it closed. The place was dimly lit, with dust and old crates scattered all around. The air smelled musty, and the faint sound of movement echoed in the empty space. The dog, still by his side, moved quickly ahead, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Danny looked around, trying to figure out what was going on. He hadn't expected the alley to lead to a place like this. It seemed strange, too quiet, too secretive. The dog, however, moved with confidence, leading him toward the far end of the room. Danny followed, feeling more curious than ever. The dog stopped in front of a large crate, barking once as if to signal that this was the spot. Danny walked up to the crate, his curiosity growing. It was an old wooden crate, covered in dust, with ropes wrapped around it tightly. He could feel that something was off about it, but he wasn't sure what. Just as he was about to inspect the crate more closely, a voice interrupted him. "That's where we keep the supplies," a worker said, stepping out from behind a pile of boxes. The man's voice was casual, but Danny noticed the tension in his eyes. Danny turned to face the man. "Supplies?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. The warehouse didn't look like the kind of place you'd store anything valuable, and the way the man had spoken made Danny suspicious. "Yeah, just stuff for the business," the worker replied, but his body language suggested he wasn't being honest. Danny wasn't sure what to think, but his gut told him something wasn't right. "Can I take a look?" he asked, his voice firm. The worker hesitated, clearly unsure, but after a long moment he nodded, still keeping a wary eye on Danny. "Sure, if you want." Danny moved closer to the crate and began inspecting it. The dog, still standing beside him, barked again, as if to urge him on. Danny felt a sudden sense of urgency. What was inside this crate that had the dog so worked up? He began to move the crate aside, and that's when things took a turn. The dog's bark turned into a growl, sharp and low, as the sound of footsteps filled the warehouse. Before Danny could react, the door at the far end of the room burst open, and a group of men stormed inside. They were dressed in dark clothes, and they looked serious. One of them had a gun, and the others were carrying large bags. Danny instinctively stepped in front of the dog, protecting it. He was used to dealing with tough situations, but this one felt different. The men were clearly there for something important, and he had just stumbled into it. "Get down," one of the men shouted, pointing the gun at Danny. The others spread out, making sure there was no way out. Danny stood his ground. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The man with the gun didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured to the dog, which was now growling fiercely, its body tense. "That dog's not supposed to be here," the man said, his voice cold. Danny looked at the dog, then back at the men. He had no idea what was going on, but it was clear now that the dog had led him into something dangerous. He didn't know who these men were or what they were after, but he wasn't going to let them hurt the dog. The dog barked again, louder this time, as if it understood what was happening. Danny took a deep breath. He had to act quickly. Without warning, Danny lunged forward, using his size and strength to push one of the men aside. The man with the gun tried to react, but Danny was faster, knocking the weapon out of his hand and sending it clattering to the floor. The dog, sensing the danger, rushed in, darting around the men and biting at their legs. It was fast, smart, and surprisingly strong, making it difficult for the men to keep their balance. Danny used the chaos to his advantage, taking down one of the men with a quick move and disarming another. The dog continued to move around, keeping the attackers distracted and making sure Danny had time to fight back. It was over quickly. The men were subdued, tied up, and left sitting on the cold floor, unable to move. Danny turned to the dog, breathing heavily. The dog was calm now, standing by his side, its tail wagging slightly. "That was impressive," Danny said, smiling at the dog. The dog looked up at him, its eyes calm but knowing. It had just helped him stop a dangerous group of criminals, and Danny couldn't help but feel grateful. The dog wasn't just a stray, it was a hero. As the police arrived and took the men into custody, Danny stood in the warehouse, feeling a strange sense of awe. He hadn't expected his day to turn out like this, but the dog had led him here, and together, they had uncovered something bigger than either of them had imagined. The adventure wasn't over yet, and Danny knew that whatever happened next, he wasn't going to face it alone. The door creaked as Danny stepped inside, and the dog quickly followed him. The warehouse was dimly lit, with dust hanging in the air and the smell of old wood and metal. The space was large and filled with stacks of crates and boxes. Danny glanced around, trying to figure out what he had walked into. The dog moved ahead, sniffing the air and trotting through the aisles of boxes, its ears perked up. Danny followed, looking around cautiously. The workers inside the warehouse were focused on their tasks, not paying attention to him at first. The sound of boxes being moved and crates being stacked echoed through the space. As Danny walked further in, the dog stopped at the back of the room, sitting in front of a large crate. It barked once, looking back at Danny, then stood up and pawed at the crate. Danny walked over to the dog, wondering what it was so focused on. "That's where we keep the supplies," one of the workers said as he approached Danny. His voice was casual, but there was something off about the way he spoke. Danny noticed the man's eyes darting to the crate, then quickly looking away. There was tension in the air that Danny couldn't ignore. Danny nodded but felt a strange sense of unease. "Can I take a look?" he asked. The worker hesitated for a second, then shrugged. "Sure, go ahead," he said, his voice sounding a bit nervous. Danny carefully moved the crate aside, revealing a hidden compartment underneath. The dog barked excitedly, urging Danny to open it. With a swift motion, Danny lifted the hidden flap, and inside he found several neatly stacked envelopes, each labeled with different names. The dog sniffed the envelopes and barked again, as if it was pointing Danny towards something important. Danny picked up the first envelope, his curiosity piqued, but before he could open it, a loud noise broke the silence. The workers in the warehouse froze, and Danny could feel the tension grow in the room. Suddenly, the door to the warehouse slammed open. A group of men stormed in, all wearing dark clothes. They shouted for everyone to get down, their faces covered with masks. Danny's instincts kicked in, and he immediately moved to shield the dog, who stood protectively in front of him, growling low. The men were armed, and Danny quickly realized they weren't here to work. They were after something in the warehouse. The crates, the envelopes, all of it was part of a larger operation, and Danny had just stumbled into the middle of it. The dog, sensing the danger, moved quickly. It darted toward one of the men, distracting him long enough for Danny to act. With one swift motion, Danny tackled another man, using his strength to bring him down. The dog continued to move, darting between the legs of the attackers, causing confusion and disorienting them. Danny fought back, using his training to overpower the men. The dog worked in sync with him, moving fast and agile, blocking the men's movements and keeping them off balance. In a few minutes, Danny had taken down 2 of the men, and the others were retreating, realizing they weren't going to win this fight. The last man, realizing he was outmatched, backed away and raised his hands in surrender. "We were just following orders," he said quickly. "We didn't want any trouble." Danny didn't let his guard down, but he nodded toward the man. "Who's behind this?" he demanded. Before the man could answer, Danny heard the sound of sirens approaching. The police were on their way. The dog had helped them take down the criminals, and now it was time to wrap things up. Danny stood up, catching his breath, and looked down at the dog. The dog stood proudly beside him, its tail wagging like it had just done something incredible. Danny smiled. "You did good, buddy," he said, reaching down to scratch the dog's ears. The dog barked happily, as if it understood. It had led Danny here and played a key role in stopping a dangerous operation. Without the dog, Danny might never have uncovered the truth. As the police arrived to take the criminals into custody, Danny felt a deep sense of gratitude toward the dog. It had been more than just a stray. It had been his partner in this unexpected adventure. And now, Danny knew he couldn't just walk away from this bond. The dog, now calm and proud, stayed close by Danny's side as the officers took the criminals away. Danny glanced down at the dog and smiled, knowing that this was the beginning of a new chapter. With the intruders tied up and the police on their way, Danny took a moment to look through the envelopes. As he opened the first one, he felt a sense of unease. Inside was a set of papers, but they weren't just ordinary documents. They contained detailed information about a major underground operation. Danny scanned through the papers quickly, his eyes widening as he read about stolen goods, secret deals, and a crime syndicate operating right under everyone's nose. But what caught his attention the most was the last page of the folder. It had a list of names, and one of those names was familiar to him, someone he had seen on TV recently. It was clear now that this was not just a small-time operation. It was part of something much bigger, involving dangerous people with a lot of power. The dog, still standing by his side, barked once and nudged him with its nose. Danny looked down at the animal, his heart racing. Could it be that the dog had led him here to stop something this big? The dog had guided him to the crate, and now it was helping him uncover this illegal operation. Danny felt a deep respect for the dog, realizing that it wasn't just a stray. It was an active part of this mission, playing a role he never expected. Danny flipped through the rest of the envelopes, and each one revealed more shocking details. The syndicate had been smuggling high-value items, using warehouses like the one they were in to hide the goods. The dog had brought him here, and now he knew exactly what he had to do next. Just then, the sound of sirens grew louder, and the door to the warehouse opened. The police had arrived. Danny stood up, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The dog barked once more, its tail wagging, as if to say that the job was done. As the police walked into the room, Danny explained what had happened, how he followed the dog into the warehouse, uncovered the crates, and found the papers that linked the operation to a bigger syndicate. The officers were surprised, but they quickly took charge, arresting the men who had been guarding the crates. "Good work, Mr. Johnson," one of the officers said, nodding at Danny. Danny smiled and looked down at the dog. "It wasn't just me. This guy did most of the work," he said, giving the dog a pat on the head. The dog looked up at him, its eyes bright with happiness, as if it knew it had done something important. Danny felt a deep sense of gratitude toward the dog. It had been his guide and protector, leading him to uncover a criminal operation that could have continued for much longer if not for the dog's actions. The police took the paperwork and began questioning the suspects. Danny, now feeling a sense of closure, walked out of the warehouse with the dog by his side. As they left, he realized that the adventure he had stumbled into wasn't just about stopping criminals. It had led him to find a new companion, one who had proven to be brave, clever, and loyal. "Looks like we make a pretty good team," Danny said with a smile as they walked into the night. The dog barked in agreement, and Danny couldn't help but laugh. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to be alone on any adventure from here on out. The dog had found him in the middle of a busy intersection, and now it had led him to a bigger purpose. Together, they had uncovered a hidden crime syndicate. It was only the beginning of their partnership, and Danny was excited to see where it would take them next. After the police had arrived and taken the criminals away, Danny stood alone in the now quiet warehouse. The dog was sitting beside him, its tail gently wagging. Danny looked down at the dog, who seemed to be as calm as ever after the chaos. It was as if nothing had happened, but Danny knew that what had just occurred was no small thing. The police were wrapping things up, talking to the workers and taking the stolen goods for evidence. Danny walked over to the dog, his hand reaching down to pet its head. The dog looked up at him, eyes filled with trust. Danny smiled and crouched down. "You did good, buddy," Danny said, his voice soft but filled with respect. He had never imagined that a stray dog would lead him to uncover a dangerous criminal operation. The dog had reacted quickly during the confrontation, helping to distract the criminals long enough for Danny to take control of the situation. The dog gave a small, happy bark, as if it understood Danny's praise. It wagged its tail and nuzzled against Danny's leg, looking up at him with those big, trusting eyes. For a moment, Danny stood there, scratching the dog's ears. He realized that the dog wasn't just an ordinary stray. It was smart, brave, and had helped him in ways he hadn't expected. The workers had begun to leave, and Danny walked back toward his car, the dog following closely behind. The warehouse was now quiet, but Danny knew that this was the end of one story and the beginning of another. He hadn't just solved the case, he had found a new companion. The dog trotted beside Danny as they walked, its steps light and quick. Danny glanced down at it, thinking about how strange this whole situation had been. It all started with a dog blocking traffic at an intersection, and now he was walking away with a new friend. Life had a funny way of surprising him. Danny reached his car and opened the door. The dog immediately hopped into the passenger seat, making itself comfortable. Danny laughed, shaking his head. "You've earned the ride," he said with a smile. He slid into the driver's seat, and as he started the engine, the dog looked up at him, tail wagging. As they drove away from the warehouse, Danny couldn't help but think about what had just happened. The dog had been the key to uncovering something much bigger than either of them could have imagined. And now as they headed down the road, it felt like the start of something new. "This could be the start of a great partnership," Danny said to the dog, who responded with a happy bark. Danny grinned, feeling a sense of excitement about the future. With a dog like this by his side, who knew what kind of adventures lay ahead? As they drove off into the night, Danny felt certain of one thing. This was just the beginning of an incredible journey together. Danny Johnson's car hummed softly as he drove down the quiet streets, the night settling in around him. The dog sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window with its ears perked up, tail gently swishing in the air. Danny glanced over at the dog, a smile crossing his face. The whole day had been unexpected, to say the least, but he couldn't deny the bond that had formed between them. Earlier, Danny had never imagined that a random stray dog blocking an intersection would lead him to uncover a hidden crime ring, or that he would be sitting here now, with that same dog riding next to him. The events of the day felt like something out of a movie, and yet here they were, two unlikely partners. As they drove through the city, Danny couldn't stop thinking about how everything had unfolded. The dog had acted as if it knew exactly what it was doing, guiding him through the chaos. It wasn't just a random stray, it was sharp, brave, and had led Danny to the warehouse, where they had discovered the criminal operation. In the end, the dog had played a crucial role in taking down the criminals. "So what now, huh?" Danny said aloud, though he wasn't really expecting an answer. The dog turned its head toward him, as if listening carefully, and Danny laughed. "I guess we're in this together now." The dog gave a soft bark, as if in agreement, and looked out the window again. Danny smiled, knowing that he had just made a new loyal companion. It wasn't every day that something like this happened, and he couldn't help but feel lucky. As Danny continued driving, he thought about the future. The day had started with a strange encounter in the middle of an intersection, and now it had led to the discovery of a huge crime syndicate. But the adventure wasn't over. There was still so much more to uncover, and he had a feeling that the dog would be right there by his side, ready for whatever came next. Pulling up to his house, Danny parked the car and turned off the engine. The dog sat up, ready to go. Danny got out of the car, and the dog quickly followed, trotting behind him as they walked up to the front door. When they entered the house, the dog looked around curiously but seemed comfortable, settling into its new surroundings almost immediately. "All right, this is your new home, buddy," Danny said, walking toward the kitchen. He grabbed a bowl and filled it with water, placing it on the floor. The dog sniffed it for a moment before eagerly drinking. Danny watched, feeling warmth in his chest. The dog had been through a lot, and yet it was here, safe and sound, ready for the next chapter. It had shown him trust, courage, and loyalty from the moment they met, and now they were a team. As the dog finished its water, Danny leaned down to scratch its head. "You've earned a good rest," he said with a chuckle. The dog looked up at him, giving a happy bark in response. Danny smiled as he stood up. "You and me, we've got a lot of work ahead of us." The dog wagged its tail, and Danny could feel the bond growing stronger. It wasn't just about stopping criminals or solving mysteries anymore. It was about a new beginning. Together, they were ready for whatever came next. With the dog by his side, Danny knew one thing for sure. This was the start of an incredible adventure. The mystery they had uncovered was just the beginning, and as they settled in for the night, Danny felt grateful for the unexpected turn his day had taken. "You and me, partner," Danny said softly, looking down at the dog. The dog wagged its tail once more, as if agreeing. The future was unknown, but one thing was certain: they were ready to face it together.